Hi guys, it's me, Mr. Lansford. I know it's been a little bit since you guys have seen me and talked to me, and I'm sorry about that. I wish things would have ended different. I wish I could at least said goodbye to you guys, but no one knew what was gonna happen going into spring break, and sometimes this is how stuff goes. So I hope you guys are doing well, and you guys are safe, and your families are safe. I just want you guys to know I really enjoy teaching you guys this class, and I'm I hope that you guys just go on and do really well. Okay? So from today on, I'm going to start helping producing some video lessons for you guys to make sure you are at least somewhat entertained during house arrest, essentially, right? So today we're going to be starting with a lesson over the stock market crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s, right? So let's just jump into it. So, I know that we didn't get to finish our 1920s unit together in class, so I'd like to go over just some basic stuff to make sure that we understand what was going on in the 1920s before we get to the 1930s, right? So, remember, America was on a huge economic boom after World War One. So, America ramped up its manufacturing, right? So, the production of goods, uh, but for the war. So, it was like foods, weapons, cars, planes, that kind of stuff, right? But after the war, they were able to pivot, all that manufacturing to stuff that they could sell on the market. Like, the things that we were really good at producing were like food, cars, and house products like ovens and refrigerators. And because of this huge manufacturing power, America became very powerful in the world economy, right? We were able to produce stuff and sell stuff. So, also something very important to talk about is that during the 1920s, buying on credit becomes very popular. Buying on credit just essentially means you don't pay for something when you buy it, right? It's like a credit card. You swipe your credit card, but when you swipe your credit card, you're not paying for it. Then you get a bill at the end of the month saying, "Hey, you spent this much with your credit card. Pay it all now." Right? So buying things on credit, you're not paying for it now. You're generally paying for it over time, over a long period of time instead of paying for it up front. Right? So the stock market crash of 1929. It's pretty famous, and I'm sure most of you have heard of it. But in order to go over why it happened and what was going on with it, we'll have to talk about stocks, right? So a stock is essentially the idea that you own a part of a company. So let's say you want to buy a stock in Apple for $100. So you go to Apple and say, "Hey, I want to buy a stock in you," and they go, "Okay." It's $100, and you pay them their $100, and you get one stock in return. That stock is tied to how well that company is doing. So if Apple does really well in the next couple of years, then the value of your stock goes up. If the Apple does really bad in the next couple of years, your stock will go down. So, if say that Apple does really well over the next couple of years, your stock may go up in value up to like $150, right? So then you could sell it to somebody else and get $50 out of the transaction. If Apple does really bad, that stock you bought for $100 might only be worth $50 in the next couple of years, and then you lost $50 on that transaction, right? So that's the idea of kind of how stocks work. The reason why the stock market crashed is kind of complicated, but it comes down to the sentiment that in the 1920s, people believed that the stock market couldn't lose money. Uh, the America had been in an economic boom for the last 10 to 20 years, and it became this idea that no matter what you invested in, you were gonna make money. The value of that stock was gonna go up, and you were gonna make money. And this wasn't necessarily the case. Many companies towards the end of the 1920s actually started to lose value, right? They started to do worse. But the value of their stock kept on going up because people just didn't think stocks could go down anymore. They just went up, and that's just how things were. And this made a discrepancy between how much the stock was worth and how much the company was actually worth. And that creates something what we call is a bubble. So, what is a bubble? Oh, you probably have heard someone talk about this if you've heard anything about the 2008 housing crisis. Like we said before, a bubble is just this concept that the value of a stock versus the value of the company is very extremely different, right? The stock is worth way more than the actual company is valued at. And when that bubble bursts, or when that bubble pops, however you want to say it, it's when people realize that the stock of that company is overvalued and the stock drastically and sharply drops to the company's actual price. And you can see that in our chart here. You see such a steep dive. Um, in the 2008 housing market crisis, it was because it was just in the housing sector, right? But this goes beyond that. This goes beyond just the housing market. This goes into all different sections of the American economy, right? And this day becomes known as Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. And in this one day, billions of dollars were lost. Though this didn't immediately lead into the Depression. As you can see on the chart here, America's economy starts to tick up and starts to restabilize. But this won't last for very long. The final nail in the coffin is bank runs. This is what really sets off the Depression. Um, to understand how this happened and what bank runs are, you need to understand how banks used to work. Back in the 1920s, there was a lot less regulations than there are on banks now. There wasn't any regulations about how much money banks needed to have inside and how much money banks could loan out. And the way it used to work back then was say you had $3,000 and you wanted to put it in the bank for safekeeping, right? And earn a little bit of interest. Most banks will offer interest, right? So, you put $3,000 into the bank, and the bank takes that money. And then say I come along to the bank and say, hey, I need $1,000 loan to start up my new business. The bank says, okay, and they take $1,000 of your $3,000 you put in the bank and give it to me. And then I take that $1,000 and invest that into my business, and I will start to slowly pay that back over time. But they don't have your whole $3,000 anymore. They have $2,000 left, and they'll hopefully make more money over time and get the money back. And the reason that is because they don't expect you to pull out all $3,000 at once. They don't expect you to pull out everything. They expect you to pull out only small portions of it, a couple $100 at once as you need, right? And now that isn't a problem as long as people believe that the banks will work and stay afloat, right? But the problem is after the stock market crashed, there was a lot of worry about what was going to happen. And people started to think maybe the banks would fail. Um, and because of that, people were afraid the banks were going to fail. People started going to the banks and pulling out all their money, right? They go to the bank and start pulling out all their money. And the problem is, eventually, the banks ran out of money. They couldn't pay everyone back because they didn't have all their money. They would invest it in different companies and people. And so they didn't just have everyone's money for them inside the bank. Um, and because this starts happening, you know, banks start to fail, right? If the bank can't pay back the money it was deposited by everyone, it fails, and the bank stops existing. Um, and that's a really big problem. Thousands of people, as you can see in the picture here, thousands of people around America starting after the stock market crash in 1929, going into the early 30s, thousands of people just start going to banks and start pulling out all their money. And thousands of banks start crashing, right? Banks start failing and they can't stay afloat any longer because everyone is pulling out all their money. Ironically, because people were afraid of banks failing, they pulled out all their money. By pulling out all their money, they caused the banks to fail. So it's ironic that they caused the thing that they were afraid of happening. Um, Banks failing is a really big problem for the American economy, right? Americans, the way that the American economy runs is that, okay, like we said earlier in my example, I want to run a business, right? I want to start making more money. Um, and I want to start, to become start. I want to make a business, start making more money, start progressing, and start progressing the economy, right? So I get a loan from the bank, and that helps me create that, and then I pay the bank back extra from what I borrowed, and that gives the bank more money to pay to someone to loan to someone else, so they can make more money, and then pay that back to the bank, and then the bank can loan that out to someone else. It's a cycle, right? So the idea that the banks really kind of help flow money from person to person, from business to business, and keep the economy going. When all the banks start to fail, that ability is removed and the economy slows to a halt. As well, because everyone was so scared about what was coming up and what was happening with the stock market crash, people stopped spending. People just stop spending extra amount of money and start saving a whole bunch, um, which causes less money to be put into businesses, which means businesses can't pay their workers, and businesses can't pay their workers. People don't get paid, and then people don't have enough money to buy things, and it's also another cycle that just slowly grinds the economy to a halt. Um, so these are the really two major events when we talk about the start of the Great Depression. These are really the two major events: the stock market crash, Black Tuesday, and the subsequent bank runs that happened because of the fear of what was going to happen and the fear that banks are failing because of the instability of the stock market, right? So that is our first video lesson for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something new. I'll have more coming up about the 1930s and the Great Depression in just a little bit. Stay safe and stay healthy. Mr. Lansford signing off.